This is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to provide a guide for students getting started in Lesson 10 of the Academy's Latin Grammar 1 course. For the first 9 lessons we studied what's called orthography, the study of the letters and sounds of the Latin language, and here in Lesson 10 we move into the second part of the study of grammar, which is etymology. And you can see on the screen here in Article 16, we begin the study of the parts of speech. Now, when we think about language, we communicate with sentences. We express complete ideas in sentences, and sentences we might think are made up of words, but that really wouldn't be a good explanation of how sentences are composed. It's more proper to say that sentences are made up of the parts of speech. So, with a sentence being considered the whole, the parts of speech are considered the parts of which sentences are composed. So let's begin Article 16 here and study together the parts of speech in Latin. We read Article 16. It says, the parts of speech are, and here we have a list of the parts of speech. And now, if you study different grammar texts from different periods of history, you might find a different list of the parts of speech. And I'll comment on that in a little bit, but let's just go through the list here in Article 16. The parts of speech are, first, the noun, and we see in parentheses here, substantive and adjective, because these are two kinds of nouns. Second, the pronoun. Third, the verb. And fourth, the particles. And don't get this word confused with participles. We have noun, pronoun, verb, and particles listed here as the parts of speech. And then contained within a few of these are a number of different species, we could say, or classes of the parts of speech. So for nouns, we have two different kinds of nouns. We have substantives and adjectives. And then for particles, we have adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions. So we have a list here of the parts of speech. Now, in other grammars, as I said, you may find that there are 8 parts of speech listed: noun, pronoun, verb, participle, preposition, conjunction, adverb, and interjection. Those are the classic 8 parts of speech. But here in Gildersleeve's Latin, he presents them a bit differently to try to make the study a bit more convenient for us. So let's look again at the parts of speech that he lists: the noun, the pronoun, the verb, and particles. The noun divides into substantive and adjective, and the particles are adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions. Okay? You'll notice that he does not include participles in the parts of speech because he considers participles to be a kind of verb or a form of a verb. You'll also notice that he doesn't include interjections, and he'll talk about them in a little bit, so we'll leave the discussion of interjections for the time when he actually addresses it. But again, Article 16, the parts of speech are the noun, the pronoun, the verb, and the particles. And now we can see here in notes 1 through 7, he breaks this down into more detail. So let's go ahead and read these 7 points that he makes on the parts of speech. Number 1, he says the substantive gives a name. And remember, he listed substantive as one of the 2 kinds of noun. Remember, this English word noun simply means name. So the first part of speech is simply the name, and there are 2 kinds of names: substantive names and adjective names. So noun and name, they have the same meaning, two different forms of the same word. So in point 1 here, we learn about the first kind of noun, which is a substantive. And we learn very simply, a substantive noun simply gives a name. And we've got a few examples here. First of all, we have the common name wir or wir, which means man. So this is a common noun, a common substantive noun, because it refers to a class of things. It's a name of a class of things. Wir in classical Latin, wir in church Latin. It means man, a common substantive noun. Then we have kokles. Kokles, you can see the uppercase k. This is a proper substantive noun. It names an individual. Wir names a whole class. Kokles names an individual in that class. Kokles is a proper substantive noun. And then lastly, donum. Donum is the name for a gift. Donum is a substantive. It's a common substantive noun. So the substantive noun simply gives a name. Second, the adjective noun adds a quality to the substantive. The adjective noun adds a quality to the substantive. And it's good that he describes the adjective like this, because an adjective cannot exist in speech by itself. There must be a substantive in order for us to speak an adjective, or it can't make any sense. Just think, for example, an adjective could be a color like blue. There's no way for us to think of blue unless we think of a blue something, and that something would be a substantive noun. So an adjective adds quality to a substantive. There must be a substantive already in mind before we can think of an adjective. The adjective, and this word adjective means set next to. The word substantive means standing alone. So stands by itself, a substantive noun, is set next to a substantive, is an adjective noun. The adjective adds a quality to the substantive, and we're given an example here. Bonus wir. Bonus wir. Wir means man, bonus means good. The adjective noun bonus adds a quality to the substantive noun wir. We saw wir here, it just meant a man. But now bonus wir adds a quality. What kind of man? A good man. That's an adjective noun. So the two kinds of noun are substantive and adjective, and we have their description here with some examples. Next, point 3, the pronoun. The pronoun points out something without describing it. The pronoun points out without describing. Now notice the name, pronoun. The word pro in Latin means in place of or for, and then we have the word noun. So a pronoun is a word that stands in place of a noun. A pronoun points something out without describing it, and we're given 3 examples here. First, the Latin pronoun hic, which means this. So imagine if someone said, if you said, I have a shirt, and someone said, what shirt? And you pointed to your shirt and said, this. A pronoun like hic, which means this, points something out without describing it. This shirt. Ille in Latin means that. That thing over there. Ille. That. It points something out without describing it. And lastly, the example ego, which is a personal pronoun. Ego means I. If someone asked, who knocked on the door? You could say, I. You could point yourself out without describing yourself. That's a pronoun. Ego, I. So we have 2 types of nouns so far, and then the pronoun. Next, in point number 4, we have the verb. Now, it's important to note that in Latin, the word verbum just means word. So the word verb, or in Latin verbum or verbum, just means word because it's the principal word of a sentence. The verb expresses a complete thought, whether an assertion, a wish, or a command. A verb expresses a complete thought, whether an assertion, a wish, or a command. Now, an assertion is a statement that can be true or false, like the sun is shining. That's an assertion. It can be true or false, a simple statement. Some refer to this as an indicative or enunciative sentence, an assertion. That's one example of a verb. A verb expresses a complete thought, whether assertion, wish, or command. Now, a wish cannot be true or false. If I say, I wish God would save all men, that cannot be true or false. A wish or a prayer cannot be true or false. It's a different kind of verb. Assertion is one kind, wish is another, and thirdly, command. If I were to pray and speak to God in terms of a command like, save, we pray, I could give a command, even though that's really in the form of a prayer. I could say to one of my children, clean your room. That would be a better example of a command. It's a different form of a verb. So we have three basic forms of verbs here: assertions, wishes, and commands. And in grammar, we refer to these as the moods of a verb, different manners or different ways of expressing a thought. Assertions, wishes, or commands. And we have three examples here. Amat in Latin is a verb. It means he loves. Amat. It's a simple assertion. He loves. Amet, which has a different form because it's a different mood, is a wish. Amet means may he love. So amat means he loves, a simple assertion. Amet means may he love. It's not a simple assertion, it's a wish. And then lastly, ama. Ama is a command. Love. Ama. So we have three examples of different forms or moods of verbs. The verb expresses a complete thought, whether assertion, wish, or command. Then in points 5, 6, and 7, we have the three particles. You see particles and then in parentheses, adverb, preposition, conjunction. We learned these down here in points 5, 6, and 7. The adverb shows circumstances. So the adverb is used to add a description to the verb or sometimes to an adjective or to another adverb. So the adverb shows circumstances. For example, if I said, he loves greatly, it adds or shows circumstances, adds detail to the verb. The adverb shows circumstances. A preposition shows local relation. That means in a sentence, a preposition shows how different words relate to one another in the sentence. And then conjunction shows connection. Conjunction shows connection. Now this is simple when we simply look at the names of these parts of speech. If we look at the word adverb, it's made of the preposition ad, which means next to, and then verb would refer to a verb. So adverb means a word placed next to a verb in order to add circumstances. Preposition, we can see the word position, which means a place, and then pre or pre means before. So a preposition is a word set before a noun that shows local relation. And then the word conjunction means to join together. Conjunction means join together. And a conjunction is a part of speech that shows connection. So if we simply look at the names of the parts of speech, they're pretty easy to remember what each is. Substantive is a name that can stand alone. Adjective is a name that's set next to a substantive. Pronoun is a name that's used in place of a noun. Verb is the main word of a sentence. Adverb is a word placed next to a verb. Preposition is a word set before a noun. And conjunction is a word that joins parts of speech together. So 7 parts of speech listed here. The reason why the number is different is simply because Gildersleeve presents the parts of speech to us in a different way. But as we'll see as we go through, the same things are taught, just it's a different method of presenting the teaching. So that's all for the parts of speech in Article 7 with 7 descriptions. I wouldn't say definitions, I would say descriptions of the parts of speech. Let's check out the remarks here. Remark number 1 says, a substantive or substantive is short for noun substantive, and adjective is short for noun adjective, because substantive and adjective are actually 2 kinds of nouns. Substantives are often loosely called nouns. So because substantives are the true names, sometimes they're referred to as nouns, but really both substantives and adjectives are names or nouns. So that's remark number 1. Now, one of the 8 parts of speech that some old grammar textbooks list is the interjection. We see that Gildersleeve didn't include the interjection in his list of the parts of speech, and here in remark number 2, he'll explain why. The interjection is either a mere cry of feeling, as ah, and does not belong to language, or it falls under one of the above-mentioned classes. So Gildersleeve disagrees that interjection should be considered a part of speech. He says that if it's a mere cry of feeling, if it's a mere expression of emotion, then really it shouldn't be considered human language, which is a good argument. If we think about the growling of a dog, that would be like an interjection. It's an expression of feeling. It's an expression of a passion, of anger. That wouldn't be considered a part of human speech. That would just be some sort of irrational sound. So Gildersleeve makes the argument that if an interjection is simply an expression of a feeling, then it shouldn't be considered a part of human language. That's a good argument. And secondly, he says if the name interjection is used to refer to something else, then we're probably going to see that it can be put into one of these other classes. So we'll have to put that idea to the test as we go through the parts of speech in our study of grammar. So anyway, if you've seen the term interjection in Latin grammar textbook, this is an explanation for why Gildersleeve did not include interjection in the parts of speech, and I think it's a good argument he makes. Remark number 3, the particles that last of the parts of speech here, particles, he says, are mainly mutilated forms of the noun and pronoun. Particles, that would be adverbs, prepositions, and conjunctions, they're mainly mutilated forms or broken down forms of the noun and pronoun. Okay? So that's all for Gildersleeve on the parts of speech. Let's just look at these 2 notes here at the end of this article. The difference between a substantive and an adjective noun is largely a difference of mobility. That means movement, the ability to move. The difference between substantive and adjective is largely a difference of mobility. That is, the substantive is fixed in its application, and the adjective is general. The substantive is fixed, and the adjective is general. So he says the difference is primarily a difference of mobility. The substantive is fixed, whereas the adjective can move. It's general. Note number 2. Nouns and pronouns have essentially the same inflection. We're going to study inflection in the next lesson. Noun and pronoun have essentially the same inflection, but they are commonly separated partly on account of the difference in signification, that means what the words mean, and partly on account of certain peculiarities of the pronominal forms, that means the forms of pronouns. So noun and pronoun have essentially the same inflection, and we'll see that when we study the inflection of nouns and pronouns, but they are commonly separated because of the difference in signification, that is, because they mean different things or they signify different ideas, and partly on account of the peculiarities or the unique differences that are found in the forms of pronouns, in the pronominal forms. Okay, so some of these ideas we'll have to wait until future lessons to understand what he's referring to. But remember, this is a reference grammar. It's a book that's meant to be used to study through and then referred back to as we continue our studies. So there in Article 16, we have an overview of the parts of speech. Now, why this is so important is because this catalog of the parts of speech really becomes the table of contents for the rest of our study of etymology, which is the second part of grammar. So for the rest of our study of grammar, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be studying all of the different forms and meanings and uses of these parts of speech. So this is really an introduction and an outline to what we're going to be studying for the rest of Latin Grammar 1. When we get to the next section, which is syntax, we'll move to Latin Grammar 2. So for the rest of this course, for the rest of Latin Grammar 1, we're going to be studying these parts of speech. I hope that's a helpful walk through this first reading of Article 16 in Lesson 10. Study this lesson for mastery. As I said, this is an outline of the rest of our study in Latin Grammar 1. So take the time, make sure you understand everything in this lesson, ask questions if anything is unclear, complete the assessments, and when everything looks good, we'll move on together to Lesson 11. I hope that's helpful. God bless your studies.